Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Dr. Swenson, all the panelists. And please sit back and relax. And next, we'll turn to the next segment about One Health. To moderate this segment, we have with us Michelle Crum, Principal of Food Forward LLC, former Vice President of Animal Health and Welfare at Hormel Foods, Jenny-O. So, Michelle, we have a slide that shows the speakers, and then feel free to do one-shot introduction, then sit back and have them present. I will turn the podium to you.
Great. Thank you, Min. Good morning, good evening. Thank you all for being able to join us today. Very excited to introduce our three panelists, speakers for our One Health segment. So first, we have Qijing Zhan, who's a professor at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Iowa State University. He is also a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, as well as a fellow of the American Academy of Microbiology. Then we will have Hu Zhangding, who is also a professor and Deputy Director General of the Institute of Agricultural Economics and Development at the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences. And then to round us out, we will have Dr. Raina Plowright, who is a professor of public and ecosystem health at Cornell University.
Michelle,
Zhang?
Sorry to really, I just noticed, Dr. Zhang, I apologize, we got the pictures messed up. So the second picture is Dr. Zhang. So,
no worries.
Okay, thank you.
Qijing, I'll turn it over to you, good sir.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Crum, and also good evening, good morning. It's my pleasure to be here today to share with you some of my thoughts on food safety and antimicrobial resistance related to One Health. So, by the way, so I like the picture suite because Dr. Hu looks much younger than I am. Anyway, so I started with a brief concept on One Health because some of you may not be familiar with this concept. So basically, I copied this from a joint definition by FAO, ORE, and WHO. So One Health is both a concept and approach. As a concept, it recognizes the interdependence of human, animal, and environmental health. Now, also it represents a holistic approach. It emphasizes collaborations, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary collaborations at a local, national, and international level. So the ultimate goal of One Health is to achieve optimal health outcomes for people, animals, plants, and their shared environment. Now, there are many One Health challenges out there, such as emerging pathogens, zoonotic diseases, foodborne diseases, antimicrobial resistance, and climate change. So today, I just briefly discuss two things: foodborne disease and antimicrobial resistance, how they are related to One Health. So, and currently, foodborne disease is caused by pathogens associated with the food chain. So according to CDC, in the US alone, there are 48 million cases of foodborne illnesses, and worldwide, about 600 million cases, according to the estimate by WHO. There are, different kind of foodborne pathogens, bacteria, virus, parasites, and most of them are, they reside in the intestinal tract of animals. So they contaminate milk, meat, and eggs we consume. So foodborne disease is a big concern for food safety and public health. It's also a threat to animal agriculture because of the recalls and economic loss. And also some of the foodborne pathogens also issues for animal health because they cause, disease in animals too. Additionally, foodborne disease is concern for international trade, both, export and import. And I will, touch on that a little bit later on. So foodborne disease, I want to emphasize, is not just a local problem because the food we consume could be, from far away. We have a globalized food supply chain, and we have, very active international trade. I want to use this as example. This is published in Emerging Infectious Disease 2017. So in the US, 97% are fish and fish shells, and 50% of fresh fruits consumed here are imported somewhere else. So food produced locally may affect, people's far away. One example is the disease outbreaks related to imported produce and seafood in the US. You can tell over the years, the number of our outbreaks associated with the import food actually are increasing, although the overall number of outbreaks associated with food are decreasing. Another example is the salmonella outbreaks in EU associated with imported poultry meat from Brazil. That has been published in multiple publications out there. So now the second point I want to make is about antimicrobial resistance. So, some people would say this is a silent pandemic. So antibiotics are very important for both human medicine and agriculture. So due to the selection pressure, the widespread use of antibiotics in both, human medicine and animal production, as well as the crop production, there's a rising resistance to antibiotics. So according to the publication in Natural Microbiology, people estimated by 2050, the economic loss on worldwide scale would be more than $100 trillion by 2050. And the annual deaths, attributed to AMR could be 10 million. So that's, pretty huge number. But I want to emphasize, the impact in developing countries are especially big. For example, Asia and also Africa. Now, AMR is truly a One Health problem. This is because AMR bacteria genes are everywhere, on farms, in hospitals, and in the environment. And also many factors contributed to the rising prevalence. It's not just one thing, okay? So AMR is not only a medical problem, but also a major implications for animal agriculture. So this is also very recent publication estimated, the use of antibiotics in food animal production. There's clearly increasing demand for animal proteins, especially for countries are rapidly developing, such as China. So, and also there's, increased adoption of the integrated and intensive production practices out there. So we do need antibiotics for, maintaining animal health and welfare. So it's, antibiotics is very important for, maintaining animal production efficiency and productivity. So according to this estimate in 2017, there was about 93,000 tons of antibiotics used for animal production. You can tell most of them are in those countries with very heavy agriculture, such as China, Brazil, and the US. And by 2030, there will be, about 100,000 tons of antibiotics used in animal agriculture. So now, I wanted to emphasize antimicrobial resistance. Certainly, it's not only issue for human medicine, but also threatens the security and sustainability. Because of AMR, and antibiotics become less effective in disease prevention and control, that would add economic burden for producers and also AMR's food safety and public health concern, because AMR can be transmitted to humans through the food chain, and can actually, the production systems may spread AMR to the environment through manures and water and other things. So, and also AMR can spread both locally and globally through the supply chain. So, and another thing I want to mention is about the societal pressure. There's, consumer demand. We have to, take care of that in consideration too, because in general, there's a worldwide trend for reduced use of antibiotics in food production. And there's a good possibility less and less antibiotics will be available for animal agriculture. So that poses, huge challenge, but also presents some opportunities for animal agriculture. So I would think, it's, certainly we can take advantage of the challenge to upgrade production practices and systems, not just rely on, antibiotics for productivity, especially for those countries who have not fully developed the production practices. I think there's a lot of room to improve. Secondly, we can improve management, by security, hygiene, nutrition, and all the things would reduce the need for antibiotics, and also would increase, the productivity of animal agriculture. Lastly, we need good alternatives for antibiotics, and there are many of them out there, such as probiotics, phytochemicals. But I want to just show one thing. I think, to me, the most effective alternative is just vaccines. I show use this example. This is from Norway. It's Norway has big production of salmon, and this is their historic data with how vaccines contribute to the reduction of antibiotic usage. You can tell early 80s to early 90s they used a lot of antibiotics in salmon to prevent disease, control diseases. Then since the early 90s, they introduced very effective vaccines. And since then, they pretty much a limited use of antibiotics. You can tell the use of antibiotics now is very minimal. So I want to emphasize this is a relatively, simple production system, right? So we would not expect everything would work this way, but it certainly, give us some hope for, develop effective vaccines. One challenge we are facing is the shortage of the bacterial vaccines. So, there are many reasons for that. Antibiotics have been working well, especially in the early years. And also, many of these bacteria, pathogens are secondary to viral infections. But, the bottom line is we don't have enough vaccines for bacterial infection, okay? And the current available vaccines, many of them sort of expectations, limited efficacy, short durations of immunity, and there are some safety concerns with live attenuated vaccines. Salmonella is one of the example, right? Some of them not user-friendly. So we do have rooms to develop new and improved vaccines, particularly, I want to mention, we could prioritize pathogens and disease based on the animal species, and also take advantage of the new technologies, such as vaccine formulations, adjuvant and deliver platforms. I think there's a lot of rooms we can do to improve vaccine development for bacterial diseases. And there's I had a quick review on foodborne disease and AMR. I think they are pretty challenging for a few reasons. First, they are broadly distributed, and there are many different reservoirs, farm animals, wildlife environment. So it's not just one source. It's hard to get rid of them from a single source. And there are also multiple route of transmissions, contaminations in the during the food production system. And thirdly, they actively multiply in animal intestine. So their numbers, they can multiply and increase their numbers in the intestinal tract without inducing clinical disease. And as I mentioned, sometimes it's very difficult to develop vaccines, to control that. So if, I want to just briefly share some of my thoughts for, best practices to address food safety and AMR. So certainly, there are, One Health issues. We need to take a holistic One Health approach. Secondly, I want to emphasize collaborations, and certainly we need collaboration across different sectors: industry, government, general public, and we also need collaboration, between different professions: veterinary medicine, public health, and also human medicine. And also we need collaboration at a regional, national, and international levels. So these issues are not just local, one nation's issues. Pathogens, AMR, they do not respect boundaries. So I want to just, quickly summarize what I shared with you today. Certainly, in my view, foodborne pathogens and AMR present a major challenge to One Health. They're also detrimental to food safety and sustainability of animal agriculture. So in my view, there will be reduced availability of antibiotics, and this present both a challenge and opportunities for food animal agriculture. So finally, I want to say collaborations across these different disciplines, agencies, and nations are necessary to reduce AMR and improve safety. So I'll stop here. Wanted to hear from other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhijing. And next up, Dr. Wu. You ready?
Yeah.
There you are. Good
Yes,
evening.
yes.
Well, I guess good morning.
Already. Yeah, good morning. Yeah, I think maybe it was good evening. Huh?
Yes. Going to hear from you about healthy development of China's pig industry based on the perspective of biosecurity, which I think is a really nice segue from what Dr. Zhijing just shared with us. So please take it away.
Okay, just for a moment, I will share my PPT. So now you can say the PowerPoint. It's okay now.
We can.
Oh.
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay, thank you, moderator, and good morning, everyone. I'm from the IED and CAS. Thanks for the invitation to share some research. Today my topic is about the healthy development of China's pig industry based on the perspective of biosecurity. My content is about four parts. First one, I want to introduce a little bit about China's pig industry, and then to tell why I choose this biosecurity and for the Africa swine fever, because I want to make the example. And the third is for the second part, and the third part is first for the macro level and farm level. So the next one is for the conclusion. Firstly, I want to introduce a little bit about the pig in production. And I think most people know China is the biggest producer in the world. But I know in the second place is the US. And almost we have accounted 50% of the world production. Another side is how about the meat percentage, and pork almost the 60% of the meat, the total meat consumption, also production. So because in China we look the grain and pork is very, very, very important. We think it's quite important for the political stable, and so for the government, we pay more attention for the grain and the pork production. And the pork is very important meat in China for the Chinese people consumption. And the second one is for consumption. And so I just make example for the grain and pork and poultry. Everybody know, and because the Chinese people, they get higher and higher the income, and so they eat more and more meat. So you can say the grain it's dropped down from the 1981 is 223.9 kilo per year to the 2020, and I think just 120. And we need to remind, in China, where grain is included the soybeans and the potato, so it's include more the food. So this is why grain, because they include the soybeans, so it's need to be higher. And the pork and the poultry, so just 40 years, and then it's increased dramatically, especially for the poultry. I think the poultry, for a time, and then they will increase time by time. And so urban and rural, they get the similar. In past, it's very high gap. Just the urban people, they get more the pork and poultry, and but now it's almost the gap, because I know the Ghanaian, the Professor Ghanaian also introduced, we have the fat poverty, so we have more the impact in the food input consumption. And another one I want to show, the self-sufficient rate is almost the 95%. Sorry, but I need to see the why I have make the read. So this I want to tell about the Africa swine fever. So this Africa fever, and then they have a shock, so they get the down. This makes the question. So the second one I want to show how about the shock of the Africa swine fever. And the first I want to say that it's spread fast, and the first case in the 2018 August, and then just 10 months it's covered for whole province. And from our research, we think that the first the reason is the transportation of the slaughter pigs in the long distance, because in Chinese people from the south of China, they prefer the fresh meat, so they need to transport the knife pork pigs to the south place. And so in this way they have the high spread very fast. And the second one is the poor animal disease prevention and control system, especially for the smallholders. Because the smallholders, they don't have much more the experience for this new virus. So that's and also the poor infrastructure for the smallholders. And now you can see how about the SPF, the shock, for the production. It's almost 1/3 the production loss. Somebody estimate almost 1,000 billion Chinese yuan. So that's very huge loss for the pig industry. And another one is that the smallholders withdraw from the pig industry, because for the SPF, then they get withdrawals from the pigs because they get loss. So and the scaled farms, they get more and more, and so you can see about the 500 slaughtering pigs, and those farms, they produce more the pigs from the 34.5 from 2010 to the 2021. That's 60%. So that's very huge for the scaled farm. And another one for the price shock. You can say I show the circle, and this from I think in the history it's very high. the price. Just so you can say the pig needs. If we think the pig needs, it's almost 100 Chinese yuan per kilo. And if we times 10 kilo, one pig needs, and so you can say it's about 1,000 Chinese yuan for the pig needs for one head. So this very increased dramatically. And another forestry trade, because for the first part I already introduced, we have the 95% above self-sufficiency. But after the Africa swine fever, the shock, and then we imported a lot of the pork, especially from the US. And so after the Africa swine fever, and then our government give a lot of the policy support for the production, for the more production, because I already introduced our government look, the pork is very important. So give a lot of money in subsidies and to encourage farms produce more the pigs. And also the self-sufficiency rate is dropped down. So after the 1920 and then 2020, and then they get the increase, not just an import decrease and self-sufficient increase, because we want to keep for the self-sufficiency for our policy. And another one we want to simulate how about the shock of the policy, how about the epidemic. And so we built the model and to simulate the policy support, shock and or the epidemic shock. So there's a baseline for our model, and we just make we don't want to forecast how about the 2025. We just want to show how about the impact the policy or some animal disease. If the animal disease have outbreak, and then how about the influence? Okay, and the first one is for the pig epidemic, and then we can say it's very huge loss, and we imported more, and the pork price is also increase. And the second one, we also simulate the policy support. Just we give the subsidies, and then how about the pig production? How about the increase? And then they have a little bit increase, or of course because the production increase a little bit, and then pig price is get down. So this for the macro level, we just need to have the impression how about the Africa swine fever to shock our pig industry. Third one, we want just to introduce first a little bit about our field survey, and then after the ASF, and then we have make the survey just for the farm survey, and then we choose 7 provinces and 262 farms. So it's very, because in that time it's very difficult for us to make survey, because the area farmers, they don't welcome us to visit them because they worry about the disease, and so they have the very huge changes from the scaled farm and the smallholders. And I just 2017, and we can see the outside the personal and the vehicle, and you can allow enter the farms. But after this, until 2019, and then they not allowed. And so including the feed entry and the selling pig, because in past we have the selling pigs, they just go into farm and then to make deal, but now they don't allow it. And so also including the disinfection of the pig house, they just more the disinfection. So you can say before ASF and after ASF, they make the much more money input in this disinfection. And also scaled farms, they show better behaviors. because they have more experience. So now you can see these two pictures. After they transport the pigs and then they make some disinfection and and also some big scale farms, they build we call it transfer station. So all the feed, or the outside the pigs, or the outsiders, and then they need first to go into the transfer station after the disinfection and then to the feed lots. So so you can say they make the disinfection and then they transport the feed lot to the outside of the farms. They don't allow the vehicle into the farm, the feed lot. Okay, make a little bit the conclusion. First, for the pig industry, we think they tend to the scaling because after the ASF and then for smallholders they cannot more and more the disease, animal disease, they need to make control. If they cannot make control, then they get very high loss. And so another trend is the northeast, because the corn belt just in the northeast of China, and will be high potential for the pig production. In past, the northeast of China, they transport the grain, the corn, to the south of China to feed the pigs. Now it's just to feed the pigs in the northeast of China and transport the meat outside of the northeast. And second one is improve the support policy system for the pigs industry. I want to show especially for the promoting the green, healthy, and sustainable development. In past, we just keep mind they produce more. I think in next step we need to more the sustainable. We need to get together, especially for the pay more attention the smallholders. So they are just third one. I just want to say strengthen the prevention and control of the animal disease, especially for the reduction in non-distance pig transportation, because this very this is not very good, not good for the animal disease prevention. And another one, we need to provide more public service for the smallholders, because they don't have the enough experience, and then they don't know their pigs have some problem, and so they're selling their pigs and they go into the market and going through the non-distance transportation, so spread a lot of areas. So this big problem. I think this we will keep in mind how to make more the public service for them. And another one just introduce a little bit, because my team just set up after the ASF, and so our government, our institute say we need to make more the research in this field. So our teams is for the risk assessment and policy evaluation. So if somebody, if you have something interesting to want to cooperation with us, and then we can make more together to do some research in the biosecurity, because it's very, very huge potential. So and so thank you for your attention. And if you want to get more information, and then we have some papers and publish the papers, and you can take a look. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Hu, for the very enlightening presentation. It's very interesting to see those changes in the comparisons that your team was able to capture through that survey. So last but not least, Dr. Raina Plowright is here to mix things up a little bit for us. And Dr. Plowright will be speaking about spillover. The pandemic trigger is a One Health challenge. So Raina, turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me talk at this interesting symposium. Can you all see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay. I'm going to be talking about the connections among wildlife species that host viruses that are important for us, the health of the plants that provide them food, the environment that provides them food, and then human health. And this here is one of the bats that actually my group works on. They host a virus called Hendra virus that I'll be talking about a little bit today. So first, I'd like to just acknowledge that the work I'm presenting is from a large group of around 70 researchers. We work across a number of different continents on different pathogens, and we're particularly interested in the viruses that spill over from bats into humans. We're across many institutions. So all pandemics, including the one that we're still experiencing now, take this common pathway. So they start with a virus in a reservoir host species, usually a wildlife host species. The virus circulates in those populations. It's then excreted from the wildlife host. There's some kind of contact of the virus with another host. It could be a human or it could be a bridging host, like a domestic species. And then there's spread amongst that species. And if you think about how we try to prevent and prepare for pandemics, we have a number of different strategies. So we can prevent pandemics by actually intervening at this stage when the virus is in the reservoir host before the spillover event. Or we can try to contain the virus after it has spilled over into the next host, the domestic animal, the traded animal, the human. And we do that by all the methods we're so familiar with, the testing, tracing, isolating, for example. Or we can act or react once the virus is widespread within humans, usually with vaccinations and therapeutics. And if we look at how the world right now is trying to prepare for the next pandemic, essentially all of our focus is on these latter parts of the process. So trying to contain the outbreak after it started, or contain spread amongst humans after the virus is already within the human population. But there's almost no attention paid to these upstream processes. So actually preventing the virus from leaving the reservoir host and spilling over in the first place. And so our group is interested in if we could stop that spillover event, and we could therefore actually stop the pandemic before it even started. So what we're focused on is trying to really understand how these spillover events happen. What are the biological insights that we need into these systems so that we could actually stop it? And we focus on systems where spillover is very common because many of the pathogens you're very familiar with, Ebola and the coronaviruses, for example, spillover is rarely detected. So we focus on these systems like Nipah virus in Bangladesh, where here you can see over time, every dot is a spillover or a cluster of spillovers, in this case from bats directly to humans, or Hendra virus in Australia, where every dot you can see here is a spillover event from a bat to a horse, and then occasionally into humans. And by working in those systems, we can look at the patterns and really try to understand how spillover actually happens. For example, in Bangladesh with Nipah virus, this is the host. This is Pteropus medius, and we find them all distributed throughout Bangladesh. Nipah is a top 10 priority pathogen of WHO. The fatality rate ranges usually from 70 to 100% per outbreak, but there's very limited transmission from human to human. But it's a very big concern. These viruses are, if they start to transmit from person to person, this previous pandemic will actually look like just a warm-up. So with Nipah virus, the way it's transmitted to people is that people have this behavior in Bangladesh and some other parts of South Asia where they slash a hole in the palm trees, date palm trees, and then collect the sap. And it's this very fresh, sweet juice. It's actually very refreshing, and people drink it fresh on the street. Usually in the morning it's collected. But overnight, while that sap is dripping from the tree into the pot, the bats come along and they lick at the sap. And if you watch this bat carefully, see it turns upside down and it pees. It's peed right into that pot, and this virus is transmitted from urine. It's also transmitted through the saliva, through the licking. There's been some really good, very good epidemiological studies done of Nipah virus, and this was done by a group of Bangladeshi social scientists and epidemiologists. And what they showed is the red line here is the actual, the selling route of the date palm sap seller, and then all of the red dots are the people who actually died from Nipah virus, but you can see they're actually along the route that the seller took, and then actually a family as well in the village. And these are tragic events because almost everyone who's infected dies. Hendra virus is related to Nipah virus. It has a 60% fatality rate in people, 80% fatality rate in horses. And so it circulates in these large fruit bats in Australia. Doesn't cause disease in the bats. But if a bat feeds in a horse paddock and then excretes virus on the ground in urine or feces, a horse comes along, grazes the ground, grazes the grass that's contaminated. The horse can become sick and then can pass the virus on to people, usually people who are caring for sick horses. And a very high fatality rate, but very low transmission from horse to horse, and no transmission so far from human to human. But this has become an excellent case study for us to try to understand how spillover happens, because there are so many spillover events. So here you can see every dot here is a spillover. We didn't really see the virus until the 2000s. Then we started to see more and more spillover events. They're always, almost always in the winter. And they occur in these big clusters. So we'll see no virus, and then we'll see this cluster of many spillover events, many dead horses all at once in a short period of time in the same area. For example, in 2017, we had this cluster of spillover events, and this is the subtropics on the east coast of Australia. We actually went and visited these properties where horses had died. And I wanted to show you just the experience that we had on one property in particular. We had just developed this conceptual overview of how a pathogen goes from one species to another. But essentially, a pathogen like a virus, it has to go through this series of barriers. All these events have to line up. And don't worry too much about the details here, because I'm going to tell you what happened in this situation. So the owner described her horse had died from Hendra. She said it had been raining, and the horse's paddock had gotten very muddy. So she moved the horse from the paddock into the orchard. She said also a new population of bats had just appeared. These fruit bats, flying foxes, had just appeared just in a neighboring property. And the bats were in the middle of a severe food shortage, so they were starving. And because they were starving and their usual nectar that they prefer wasn't available, they actually came into her orchard where she had put her horse, and they were feeding on citrus fruits like lemons, which is a starvation avoidance. It's a food of last resort. And we know that those bats were actually shedding huge amounts of Hendra virus. We were actually sampling this population of bats, and they were shedding, excreting more Hendra virus than we've actually ever seen since. And that's because they were in this nutritional stress, they were starving. It was also raining and cold, and so the virus, we think, probably survived very well on the grass for long enough, certainly, to have an infectious dose for a horse to come along and then eat the infected grass and become sick and then die of Hendra virus. So we realized that all of these things had to come into play. The distribution of the host that had to be shedding this pathogen had to survive, the next host had to have behaviors to become infected. But many of these different things that had to line up, they're very dynamic, they're moving in space and time. And so for everything to really line up at just that one paddock where that horse died, it's really a perfect storm event. So we're asking, well, what is it that's making so many viruses now spill over from wildlife into people? What is making this perfect storm event in so many different places and different times? So the work I'm just going to present, this case study was just published in Nature and Ecology Letters, and some work is in preparation. So we've been able to summarize this whole system essentially as we've got ecological change that occurs. And this is, in this case, in Hendra virus, loss of the habitat and climate change changes the behavior of the bats, the immune function of the bats, and leads to pathogen spillover. This part is food related, and pathogen spillover is predictable and preventable. So how the ecological change is happening is that we had these bats that were nomadic, moving across the landscape in native forests, feeding on the flowers of these forests, constantly moving, but they lost a major source of their food. Here's the habitat for bats in summer. Here's the habitat for bats in winter. And that winter habitat's been selectively cleared, almost all gone now. So there's been this gradual loss of food, particularly in winter. On top of that, the bats experience these climate-driven shortages of food. So the El Nino cycle that is driven by the temperature of the Pacific Ocean causes, when we have a strong El Nino year, that then causes the buds on the trees in the native forest to not produce flowers. They don't set and they don't produce flowers. And so after an El Nino year, we get these food shortages for bats. That's when we'd see these starvation events like what I just described. The way the bats respond to this loss of food is they change their behavior. So the first thing they do is they fragment into small populations and move into human areas to find food that people might grow, like those lemons, or like weedy species like camphor laurel here, all sorts of things we plant for shade in horse paddocks, for example. Those bats then all of the bat populations start to move into these agricultural areas and urban areas. So every dot is now a bat roost, and most bats are associated with humans. When they're starving, there's not enough food, and they're in these areas where they wouldn't usually spend the winter, the bat's immune function is affected because of lack of energy, and they start to excrete virus. So here you can see the amount of virus excreted by bats in winter is much higher in these bats in new agricultural areas and urban habitats. And this leads to spillover, but it's a predictable spillover. So we have this climate oscillation that drives this food shortage. We then have a spillover event in the year following, and it's predictable in space. So the spillover events are all in agricultural areas, and we think that's because that's where horses are. And we have to have the virus go from the bat to the horse to be able to get to the human. And these spillover events, actually, we've discovered are preventable. So when a patch of remaining winter habitat, these are rare patches now, when they do produce flowers, what happens is we actually see a prevention of spillover. So we looked, for example, at the patterns of flowering of the native forest in winter. These are the flowering events in gray, and this is when there's no flowering, and the spillover here are these dots. Spillovers only happened when there was no flowering of winter of forests. What we think this happens is when there is flowering, the bats empty out of the agricultural areas and urban areas and go back into native forests. They're well fed, they're not shedding the pathogen, and they're not near horses. So this brings really a very, very simple solution, very complex ecological change leading to spillover that I've described, but a very simple solution, and that is really replant those winter flowering habitats that the bats lost. So if we deal with this ecological change that is the root cause of this spillover, then we wouldn't see the behavioral change, the immune function change, and spillover. So this has led us to thinking, well, how could we apply this then to coronaviruses, to Ebola virus, to other pathogens in other species? And we think that what we see at Hendra virus is actually generalizable. So historically, for example, we had the reservoir hosts of the virus living away from humans, having undulating cycles of infection, and really not being close to the next host to really be able to cause a spillover event. When land use change takes away the habitat, the bats have then seek habitat and seek food in human dominated areas, applying more contact. They then are stressed, are food stressed or physiologically stressed. This leads to these big humps, these big shedding pulses of viral shedding. And there's also behaviors of people and the bats actually that bring them into contact and allow the exposure to happen. And then we see spillover. But we could reverse this whole process with what we're calling ecological countermeasures, which is replanting habitat, bringing the animals back into their native habitat, making sure they're healthy enough that they're not shedding viruses in really large pulses, and making it less likely that the behaviors that lead to exposure. So essentially, this could be a pandemic prevention strategy. We have the strategic habitat restoration where we make sure that reservoir hosts don't have to change behavior or immune function. And essentially, we need diverse connected landscapes of food for these wild animal species, especially during periods of stress and resource scarcity.
Dr. Plowright, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you wrap things up a little bit so we can have time for some discussion? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problems. That was my last slide. There are many policy opportunities right now for prevention at the WHO level, G20 level, and so on. And we just need to make sure that this strategy becomes a part of those discussions. Thank you.
Thank you for presenting those case studies. So I will pause to see if our three panelists, to start with, have any questions for each other in our 9 minutes that we have remaining to kind of facilitate some of the conversation. Otherwise, I do have some questions of my own. So I'll just pause if you guys have any questions for each other at all to kick things off.
I do have one for Dr. Hu. So you mentioned from 2017 to 2019, there's a drastic change in biosecurity in swine production in China. That was driven by ASV. I just wonder if you have seen reduction of other swine diseases because of that change.
Dr. Hu, are you online?
Well, if she's not here, I have questions for Dr. Plowright too. So can I ask? So it's fascinating talk. You mentioned, in the winter time, bats, tend to shed more viruses, and that's probably related to the temperature. I wonder if climate change, if the climate is warmer, the winter is more pleasant for bat. Would that change the shedding of the virus from bats?
So I do think temperature is a part of it, but it's a little more complicated because the major reservoir bat species is moving further and further south with climate change. So they're expanding their range, and in doing so, they're finding themselves in areas where the winters are very cold. So when we catch bats, we actually find frostbite lesions on their ears. So I think that the intensifying El Nino events and the food shortages will probably override the lessening of the cold through climate change, is my guess. But very complex interactions there between all these different factors.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I was thinking too, as Dr. Hu was kind of talking about how kind of post ASF outbreak, how the pig production has shifted north, right, to be closer to where the cropland is, and in the same kind of framework around, okay, so where's that crop production going to be 20, 30, 40 years from now as we continue to see changes in weather patterns and temperatures? And again, to your point, Dr. Plowright, on changes not only affect the animals, but they also affect, right, the plants that the animals rely on. And we, of course, are animals ourselves. So there's a lot of adjustments that need to be made. Dr. Shijing, I had a question for you. You mentioned kind of the global nature of our food systems now and shared a couple examples. How, from kind of a One Health lens and keeping in mind kind of the global context of our food system, should we be thinking about antimicrobial resistance maybe a little bit differently than we have in the past, where we were maybe a little bit more segmented from each other from a global community standpoint?
Yeah, well, as a world, we share a lot of things. We share food, and also we travel internationally. So that's certainly it's the reality for now. I would say, one thing is if you look at the AMR issue, the use of antibiotics and the problems of AMR are more severe with developing countries. I would say. Because of the need for improved production practices, some of the regions have to rely on antibiotics to maintain productivity, right? So I believe this is probably it's an avoidable stage for some of the developing economies, and however, as a world, we learn from each other. I think, people can, countries can learn from the experiences from each other, the best practices in terms of control of AMR. I guess my viewpoint is we cannot eliminate AMR. AMR is just naturally occurs. Even we don't use antibiotics at all, there will be some low level AMR. However, if we wisely use antibiotics, we have, all other measures in place. I think we can control AMR at levels which is manageable, and we can still use antibiotics for animal production because we need them to keep animal healthy and also the animal welfare issues. So definitely we need antibiotics, and I'm not advocating for not using antibiotics. I mean, we invented antibiotics. There's no reason for us not to use them, right? So it's just I think from the global standpoint, I think we have a lot of experience to learn from those countries who are doing well, and we can help the developing countries to address these issues more quickly and more effectively. So I don't know if I answered your question, Michelle. So yeah.
I think you did, and it gets back to something you said too about making those preventable tools available for bacterial diseases, but also emerging viral diseases that might be different for those developing countries. That there just might not be a very effective, affordable vaccine available for some of the drivers of antimicrobial use in those developing countries. So that might be an area of opportunity, to your point, with sharing information. So at least the cycle of antimicrobial use could be shorter, and to get them to a developed status faster, right, to reduce the risk.
Absolutely. I fully agree. Yeah.
Dr. Plower, I did have a question for you and the team. The really nice example you had around Nipah virus and kind of the human behavior that was definitely putting populations at risk. So, I don't know, this might be out of your wheelhouse a little bit, but what kind of educational opportunities, because that seems like maybe my impression would be an ingrained cultural practice that might be difficult for people to choose to walk away from, or have some risk mitigation step to reduce the spillover events. Can you kind of share kind of some of the community outreach type education that went into drinking the sweet date water juice?
There's been excellent work, particularly by ICDDRB, which is a public health institute in Bangladesh, and they've come up with a really simple solution. It's a frond of bamboo that covers the pot, so it ties around the tree and covers the pot, and then the bat can't access the drips or the pot. and it's highly effective. It stops spillover, and it only costs a few cents. They're very easy to make. The problem is that to get people to change their behavior, it requires this constant intervention. So teams constantly working with the communities to change the practice. And then politically, it's very complicated because the government has said that date palm sap consumption is banned. And so they can't condone. So promoting this very simple strategy of prevention is very complicated when you're actually not supposed to drink the sap, but everyone drinks the sap. So yeah, even when we have a very simple solution, it's very difficult. I think that the tree planting in Australia is actually a little easier than just at the cover of the pot, because people plant trees for other reasons, for salinity, for agriculture, for shade, for erosion, and there's already a lot of tree planting happening, so it's a little bit more palatable for the community.
Less demand for a behavior change from us humans, right? To help with that intervention step.
Complicated.
Yes, very complicated. Thank you for those insights. Well, I really appreciate everyone's time tonight for the great cross-functional conversation around One Health, and I'll turn it over now to Yawei Liu to close us out for this morning or this evening, depending on where you are.
Thanks, Michelle. Can you guys hear me, or do I need to change?
We can.
Okay, thank you.
Nope, you're good.
Yeah, I'm Yawei Liu, the Senior Advisor on China at the Carter Center. So it's late here in the US, and it's getting close to lunch in China. So I will be very brief. The first thing I want to say is, US-China government-to-government relationship is at its lowest point. So it's very heartwarming to see people-to-people interaction is still taking place, and to see the in-person and hybrid, the virtual opening of the third agriculture roundtable between US and China, and tonight to see researchers and research and think tank fellows, scientists, professors, talking about rural problems or reform, One Health issues in both countries. As long as these interactions are still taking place, I think this relationship will be maintained, and hopefully with all effort from you and from us, we'll be able, to change the mind and heart of the decision makers in both capitals, and for them to realize that, competing is one thing, but engaging in zero-sum competition is not going to work for the people of the two countries and for the whole mankind. Tonight discussions have shown to us, we're all interconnected. For US and China not to talk about these common challenges, it's going to be catastrophic for us and for the world. Secondly, I want to mention that the US Heartland China Association and the Carter Center, we are working together. We share the same mission. After the first US-China Agriculture Roundtable, we jointly published the first report of the roundtable. It's called The Role of Agricultural Cooperation in US-China Relations. Recently, we also jointly published Why China Matters to the Heartland States with the statistics. I just sent in the link of the first report, and Ming probably can share the link of Why China Matters to the Heartland in the chat. Also, early on, Ambassador Quinn talked about, how the three people, inspired the work. He has been engaged. Norman Borlaug was one of the leaders in this area, and he has deep connection with President Carter, with the Carter Center's work. I just checked, the President Carter wrote a very long tribute to Norman Borlaug back in July 2010. And so, of course, we all know that President Carter is in hospice. We wish him all the best and a longer life, but he cares deeply about U.S.-China relationship. He was the one that normalized the relationship back in December the 16th, 1978, when the normalization communique was published simultaneously by China and the U.S. And January the 1st, 2019, finally, after 30 years of mutual hostility, the two countries came together. So in 2019, this is the last thing I'm going to say. In January 2019, on January the 17th, 2019, the Carter Center organized the 3-day meeting to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the normalization of U.S.-China relationship. Governor Holden came and spoke at this meeting. The Carter Center has just made the decision that in January 2024, next year, we're going to have another in-person meeting to commemorate the 45th anniversary of the normalization of U.S.-China relations. So I certainly hope that U.S. Heartland China Association can join us for the meeting or be part of the organizers of this meeting. I certainly hope CAS will be sending a delegation to us. Back in 2019, Institute of American Studies of CAS is a co-organizer of the meeting. I certainly hope maybe at this meeting, a panel on agricultural cooperation between the two countries could be hosted. So I want to end my main remarks by saying I have learned a lot from the speakers today. I think it is exciting to see there are so many common research topic for the scholars at both sides. But I do hope next time when we have the fourth think tank dialogue, we could plot and plan this a little bit more in depth so that the speakers are not going to talk past each other. They can look at how they can learn from each other. For example, the Mississippi River, Minnesota and Mississippi, that comparison, I think from the China side, maybe they can look at Qinghai and Jiangsu, that the two provinces are linked by one river, and look at the development patterns. And for our second One Health, it's so exciting to see Dr. Plowright research, on the spillover of the virus. I certainly hope that the researchers in China and the US, they're not going to be politicized by the geopolitical rivalry. They can they can talk about how their collaborative research will benefit people from both countries and benefit the whole world. So I want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank all the participants. And so good morning to the people in China and good evening to everyone that are here. Thank you all.
Thank you. Good day. Good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.